In the aftermath of World War I, Germany was a nation on its knees. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped the country of its territories, military power, and dignity. Inflation spiraled out of control. Unemployment soared, and hunger crept into once stable homes. In the middle of this chaos, a dangerous idea began to take root: the belief that someone had to be blamed for the collapse of the nation. This was not a new sentiment, but in the political turmoil of the 1920s, it found a voice louder and more persuasive than ever before. That voice belonged to Adolf Hitler. Recovering from his own war wounds, he began to weave a story that would change the course of history. He claimed that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield, but instead stabbed in the back by traitors within, and in his narrative, the Jewish community was cast as the chief culprit. He portrayed them as a threat to the nation's survival, accusing them of corrupting politics, controlling finance, and undermining German culture. It was a lie that many, desperate for answers, were willing to believe. This ideology went beyond mere prejudice. Hitler's obsession with racial purity painted the Jewish people not just as political or economic rivals, but as an existential danger to the so-called Aryan race. In his speeches and writings, he described them as a disease in the body of the nation, something that must be removed for Germany to be strong again. Such rhetoric would have been dismissed as the ravings of an extremist in a stable society, but in a wounded, humiliated Germany, it began to resonate. From here, the seeds of a national tragedy were sown. What began as hateful words would, over the next 2 decades, evolve into policies, propaganda, and ultimately, one of the greatest crimes in human history. The journey from post-war bitterness to the systematic extermination of millions did not happen overnight. It was a carefully constructed path, built on manipulation, fear, and the gradual erosion of empathy. In this video, we are going to uncover how an entire society was drawn into supporting, or at least accepting, an unspeakable plan. We will explore the calculated steps taken to normalize prejudice, the power of propaganda in shaping thought, and the chilling efficiency with which cruelty can be disguised as necessity. This is not just a story about the past. It is a warning for the present and the future. If you care about truth, justice, and learning from history so it never repeats itself, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell. Your support helps us bring more in-depth stories to light, stories that deserve to be remembered, told, and understood. Together, we can keep the lessons of history alive. When Adolf Hitler rose to national prominence, he understood something critical about power. It was rarely seized in a single, dramatic blow. Instead, it was cultivated, step by step, until the change felt inevitable. In the early years of his political career, he was careful about how openly he expressed certain ideas. The memory of the First World War and the economic devastation that followed had left the German public restless, but not yet ready for extreme solutions. In his speeches, he often downplayed the more incendiary elements of his worldview. Anti-Semitism, though deeply ingrained in his thinking, was at first wrapped in vague promises about national revival, economic recovery, and restoring Germany's honor. The venom was there, but it was diluted for now. This was a calculated choice. Hitler and his close circle, particularly Joseph Goebbels, knew that while prejudice already existed in German society, the leap from prejudice to state-sanctioned persecution could not be made in a single stride. The audience had to be led there, one deliberate step at a time. So the regime began to work on 2 fronts, slowly embedding discriminatory ideas into the national conversation, while simultaneously laying the groundwork for laws that would institutionalize them. At first, The changes were subtle, almost easy to overlook. There were whispers in newspapers about foreign influence in business and culture, always without naming names. Films and radio programs began to glorify traditional German values while casting suspicion on those who did not fit the ideal. Teachers were encouraged to protect young minds from harmful political ideas, a phrase that in practice meant excluding Jewish perspectives from classrooms. These moves, on their own, did not create mass outrage. They were small enough to pass as administrative decisions. But together, they began reshaping the public's perception of who truly belonged in the new Germany. Then, as the Nazi Party consolidated control, the steps became more visible. The regime moved to limit Jewish participation in public life, introducing laws that banned them from certain professions. Lawyers, doctors, and professors found their licenses revoked, their names removed from professional directories. Overnight, livelihoods built over decades were destroyed, not because of any wrongdoing, but because of ancestry. For many, the impact was devastating, yet for much of the population, the changes were distant enough to ignore. The victims were someone else's neighbors, someone else's co-workers. The pace of change was carefully managed. By introducing restrictions gradually, the regime ensured there was never a single moment that felt like a shocking break from the norm. Instead, life was altered in increments, so that what had seemed unthinkable a few years before could be accepted as just the way things are. Even those who might have felt uneasy were lulled into inaction, telling themselves it was not their fight, or that things might improve in time. The next major shift came with the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, which formally stripped Jews of German citizenship. They were no longer considered part of the national community, losing not just their legal rights but their identity as Germans. It was a seismic change, but it was presented as a bureaucratic necessity, framed as a way to protect the nation's integrity. By then, years of propaganda and smaller legal steps had numbed much of the population to the human cost of such a decision. The idea that some people were simply outsiders had been carefully normalized. For those targeted, the choices were rapidly narrowing. The tightening restrictions on employment, education, and public participation were paired with increasing pressure to leave the country altogether. Immigration was presented as a solution, one that the regime claimed would allow both parties to part peacefully. But this was a false choice. Leaving meant abandoning homes, businesses, and communities, often with little more than the clothes on one's back. Those who stayed faced growing hostility and isolation. Throughout this period, the regime's messaging was relentless. State-controlled newspapers and radio broadcasts reinforced the narrative that these measures were not acts of cruelty, but of necessity. They insisted that Germany was simply reclaiming its rightful place in the world, free from influences that weakened it. By the time more overt acts of persecution began, the groundwork had been laid so thoroughly that resistance was rare and fragmented. What made this process so effective and so chilling was its gradualism. People often imagine tyranny arriving with the sudden slam of a door, but in reality, it often comes with the slow turning of a lock, one click at a time. Each new restriction built upon the last, creating a path that seemed, to those living through it, almost natural in its progression. Few recognized that they were walking deeper into a moral abyss until escape was no longer possible. As the 1930s moved toward war, the stage was fully set. The Jewish population had been pushed to the margins of society, stripped of their rights, their professions, and their voices. They had been painted not as neighbors or fellow citizens, but as outsiders and worse, as enemies within. This transformation had not come from a single law or speech, but from years of calculated steps, each one small enough to pass without sparking mass revolt, yet significant enough to tighten the regime's grip. It is within this slow, deliberate tightening that the true danger lay. The story of these years is not just one of hate, but of manipulation of how ordinary people can be led, inch by inch, to accept the unacceptable. And it is a reminder that the erosion of rights rarely begins with an explosion. It begins with a whisper, a subtle shift, and the promise that the next step will be the last, even as it never is. By the time the Nazi regime had stripped Jewish citizens of many of their rights and pushed them to the margins of public life, the legal and political groundwork for their isolation was already in place. But to take the next step, Hitler and his inner circle knew that laws alone would not be enough. People's hearts and minds had to be reshaped until exclusion felt not only justified but necessary. For this, the regime turned to one of the most powerful tools of influence available: propaganda. At the center of this effort stood Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, a man who understood with chilling precision how to use media to mold perception. Goebbels, not content to rely on speeches or newspapers alone, he wanted to immerse the public in a carefully crafted alternate reality, one in which the Jewish community was no longer seen as part of the German story, but as a foreign, dangerous element threatening its survival. To achieve this, he oversaw an unprecedented control over film, theater, literature, music, and art, ensuring that every cultural product reinforced the same narrative. Cinema, in particular, became his weapon of choice. In an era when movie theaters were one of the most popular forms of entertainment, the screen provided a direct path into the emotions of millions. Goebbels understood that people could be persuaded more deeply by what they felt than by what they read in official decrees. Films could bypass rational skepticism, planting ideas in the mind under the guise of storytelling. The regime poured resources into producing documentaries and dramas that blurred the line between fact and fiction, presenting their ideology as undeniable truth. One of the most infamous of these productions was The Eternal Jew. Marketed as a factual exploration of Jewish life, it was in reality a grotesque fabrication designed to evoke fear, disgust, and hostility. Through stage scenes, selective editing, and inflammatory commentary, the film portrayed Jewish people as unhygienic, deceitful, and parasitic, comparing them to vermin or disease. By dehumanizing an entire population, the filmmakers invited audiences to see them not as individuals with families, hopes, and histories, but as a faceless threat to the nation's health. The film did not appear in isolation. It was supported by a constant background hum of reinforcing messages, news articles, radio broadcasts, posters in the streets, all echoing the same themes. A caricature here, a headline there, each piece on its own might seem unremarkable, but together they formed an unrelenting chorus. The repetition was deliberate. Goebbels often said that a lie repeated often enough becomes truth in the minds of those who hear it. Over time, these portrayals began to feel familiar, even natural, to audiences who had been exposed to them for years. Cultural events were orchestrated to match the messaging. Traveling exhibitions purported to show the truth about Jewish life, displaying manipulated photographs and misleading statistics. School textbooks were rewritten to present history through the lens of Nazi ideology, ensuring that the next generation absorbed these distortions as fact from a young age. The aim was not simply to convince, but to create a world where alternative viewpoints barely seemed to exist. The power of this propaganda lay not only in what it said, but in how it made people feel. Fear was a central component, the fear that the nation was under threat from within, that its strength was being sapped by an invisible enemy. Disgust was another, as the constant association of Jewish people with filth, disease, and deceit created an emotional barrier to empathy. Once these emotions took root, they could be called upon to justify ever harsher measures. A population that might have hesitated at the idea of mass persecution could be persuaded to accept it, even to support it, if they believed they were defending themselves from danger. The success of these campaigns was not universal. Some saw through the lies, recognizing the manipulation for what it was, and resisted in whatever quiet ways they could. But for many, the sheer pervasiveness of the message left little room for doubt. In towns and cities across Germany, the narrative was reinforced in the cinema, in the classroom, on the radio, and in conversations shaped by what people had been shown. Even those who did not fully believe the propaganda often found it easier to remain silent than to question the regime openly. By the late 1930s, the effect was evident. The Jewish community, once neighbors, colleagues, and friends, had been recast in the public imagination as something alien, untrustworthy, and dangerous. The years of legal restrictions and social exclusion had prepared the ground, but it was the relentless cultural assault that transformed prejudice into a widely accepted truth. When the regime escalated its policies into outright violence and deportation, the shock that might have once erupted was muted. The audience had been prepared for this next act, one scene at a time. The story of this propaganda machine is a reminder of how narratives can be weaponized when they are repeated without challenge, and how art and culture, so often a source of creativity and connection, can be twisted into tools of division. It was not simply that people were told what to think. They were shown it, again and again, until it became part of the world they believed they lived in. By the time the truth was too dark to ignore, the lie had already done its work, leaving a trail of shattered lives and silenced voices. By the time Nazi propaganda had reshaped public perception and legal measures had driven Jewish citizens and other targeted groups to the margins of society, the regime was ready to test how far it could go. Laws and films could mold opinion, but the ultimate goal went beyond exclusion. Behind doors, plans were being drawn for something far more radical and irreversible. Yet before moving openly toward the industrial-scale killings that would define the Holocaust, the leadership needed to know two things: how the German people might react, and how to carry out such operations with the highest efficiency and secrecy. This test would not begin with the Jewish population, at least not directly. Instead, it started with those whom the regime had already labeled as life unworthy of life: the disabled, the mentally ill, and those suffering from terminal illnesses. Through years of propaganda, these individuals had been portrayed not as members of the community deserving care, but as burdens draining the resources of the nation. Posters claimed they cost the state vast sums each year, framing their existence as an economic problem rather than a human one. By the late 1930s, the groundwork had been laid for what came next. The program was launched in secret. Officially, it did not exist: no public announcement, no debates in parliament, no headlines in state newspapers. Families were told that their loved ones were being moved to special facilities for advanced treatment, where they would receive the best possible care. In reality, these institutions had been converted into killing centers. Doctors and nurses, sworn to protect life, were instructed to carry out orders that violated the most basic principles of their profession. Patients were injected with lethal drugs, starved, or placed in sealed rooms where gas was released. This was known later as the T4 program, named after the address of its Berlin headquarters at Tiergartenstrasse 4. But at the time, it was a ghost operation, hidden behind a facade of medical authority. Those involved were chosen for their reliability and willingness to keep silent. Death certificates were falsified, citing natural causes or unavoidable complications. The families received letters expressing condolences, never suspecting the truth, or perhaps suspecting it but unable to prove anything. While the victims were counted in the thousands, the killings served another purpose beyond the immediate atrocity. They were In effect, a grim experiment. The regime wanted to measure public tolerance. Would there be outrage if people began to notice? Would the families protest? Or would fear and confusion keep them quiet? In rurals, whispers began to circulate about the suspiciously high death rates in certain institutions. A few brave voices, including members of the clergy, spoke out. One Catholic bishop, Clemens Vangelen, delivered a sermon denouncing the program, and his words reached enough ears to force the regime to at least pretend to pause the operation. But in truth, the killings never really stopped. They were simply shifted to less visible methods. The temporary scaling back was more about optics than morality. What the leadership learned was invaluable to their larger plans. While some resistance existed, it was fragmented and limited. Many people were unwilling to confront the state directly, especially when the victims were already marginalized. The lack of a nationwide uprising signaled that the path was open for escalation. At the same time, the T4 program provided something else the regime sought: technical experience. Doctors, bureaucrats, and engineers who participated gained practical knowledge in organizing mass killings, how to transport large numbers of people without drawing attention, how to process them quickly, how to dispose of bodies efficiently, and how to maintain secrecy. These skills, horrifying as it is to say, were directly transferable to what would later become the death camps. The gas chambers used in T4 facilities were prototypes, and the personnel trained there would later oversee the machinery of genocide in places like Sobibor, Treblinka, and Auschwitz. In this way, the program was both a test and a rehearsal. The victims were chosen in part because they were politically powerless, unlikely to inspire widespread defense. Their deaths could be hidden more easily, and any public anger could be managed or ignored. This calculated cruelty revealed how the regime thought. Every action was a step in a larger plan, each smaller atrocity paving the way for the next. For those who carried out the orders, the process of killing became routine. Language was stripped of humanity to make the work bearable for the perpetrators. Victims were called cases, their deaths treatments. Paperwork turned lives into numbers, and numbers into schedules. The distance between the person signing the order and the person closing the gas chamber door was carefully maintained, allowing each participant to feel like just one cog in a necessary machine. By the time the T4 program had claimed tens of thousands of lives, the lessons had been learned. The regime knew the limits of public resistance, had perfected the methods, and had hardened the hearts of those tasked with carrying out the orders. The transition from killing the disabled to killing millions of Jews, Romani people, and others was no longer a leap, it was a step along a path that had already been walked. Looking back, it is chilling to see how deliberate the process was. Nothing was left to chance. The murders of the most vulnerable citizens were not simply acts of hatred. They were calculated moves in a strategic progression toward mass extermination. What began behind the locked doors of hospitals and clinics would soon spread across an entire continent, scaled up until the machinery of death ran day and night, and it all started under the cover of care, in the silence of a population that did not yet realize, or could not yet admit, the darkness that was descending. By the time the machinery of persecution had been tested through secret programs like the killing of the disabled, the Nazi leadership had a clear understanding of the practical and psychological limits they were working within. They had learned that open brutality inside Germany's own borders could spark unease, even among those who had been steeped in years of propaganda. The murder of neighbors, however marginalized, had the potential to leave a mark on communities, to provoke uncomfortable questions that might spread if not contained. So the next phase of their plan would take a calculated turn. The violence would grow larger, but it would also grow more distant. This was not an accident, but a carefully crafted strategy. The regime knew that to maintain control over a population, one had to manage not only what they believed but also what they saw. Germans could be told about threats, about enemies, about the need for firm action, but they were not to witness the full reality of what that action meant. The suffering would be hidden behind borders, in territories where news could be tightly controlled, and where the victims were far enough removed from everyday life to avoid stirring empathy. Hitler himself was central to this strategy of invisibility. In the public imagination, he was to remain the visionary leader, the man who restored Germany's pride and strength, not the architect of mass killings. His speeches avoided explicit references to extermination. Orders were often given verbally, or phrased in bureaucratic language that concealed their true meaning. When documents were drawn up, they avoided linking his name directly to the bloodshed. The chain of command was deliberately structured so that responsibility could be diffused, creating layers between the top and the actual killing fields. Those who carried out the orders knew the intent, but they also knew it was unwise to speak it plainly. The decision to move mass killings far from the German heartland served multiple purposes. First, it kept the details away from the average citizen, ensuring that rumors could be dismissed as enemy propaganda or unfortunate misunderstandings. Second, it allowed the regime to exploit occupied territories, using remote sites to build facilities designed entirely for killing without the risk of local outrage destabilizing the home front. Third, it transformed the process into something abstract for those in Germany out of sight, and therefore easier to keep out of mind. The occupied East became the perfect stage for this hidden campaign. Poland, with its already existing ghettos and large Jewish population, was seen as the ideal place to construct the camps that would carry out the final solution in secrecy. Trains could transport victims hundreds of miles away from their homes, delivering them to places like Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec, locations chosen precisely because they were isolated, far from major German cities, and beyond the eyes of the German public. Even Auschwitz, which would become infamous after the war, was then known to most Germans, if as a distant labor camp, not a site of industrial-scale murder. This separation was psychological as well as geographical. For those inside Germany, the war brought rationing, air raids, and loss. But the regime worked hard to shield them from the moral burden of seeing what was being done in their name. Soldiers at the front might be ordered to round up civilians, but the worst of the killing was left to special units, to camp personnel, to those stationed far from home. Civilians might hear whispers from returning soldiers, but without first-hand experience, the reality remained hazy. It was easier to dismiss, easier to justify, easier to bury beneath the flood of official news about military victories and national renewal. Meanwhile, the propaganda machine continued its work, reinforcing the image of Hitler as a statesman and savior, a leader making difficult but necessary decisions for the good of the nation. If atrocities were mentioned at all, they were attributed to rogue elements, enemy lies, or the chaos of war. This plausible deniability was not only for foreign audiences but for domestic consumption. By keeping Hitler's image clean in the public eye, the regime ensured that loyalty to him would remain unshaken, even as the system he commanded carried out acts that would have horrified many if fully revealed. This approach also served to preserve unity on the home front. The leadership understood that German families needed to feel their sacrifices were part of a noble cause, not tainted by association with mass murder. Even those who harbored doubts about anti-Jewish measures could remain loyal to the leader if they believed he was unaware of, or uninvolved in, any excesses committed by subordinates. The distance, both physical and symbolic, between the Führer and the killings was a deliberate shield, protecting the bond between ruler and people. But distance did not mean ignorance. Many Germans suspected. Some knew, and others chose not to know. The strategy worked not because the truth was completely hidden, but because it was easy to avoid confronting it directly. A neighbor might mention a letter from a relative stationed in the east. A soldier might speak of trains packed with people, yet without direct proof. These stories could be filed away as rumors or wartime exaggerations. The regime had learned in the T4 program that silence could be bought with uncertainty and fear, and now they applied that lesson on a continental scale. By keeping the killings far from home, avoiding open discussion, and ensuring that Hitler's name never appeared on the orders for mass murder, the Nazi leadership created a system in which millions could be killed while the society that enabled it remained largely insulated from the full horror of its actions. It was a strategy as cold as it was effective, one that allowed the perpetrators to carry on their work without igniting the kind of widespread moral reckoning that might have disrupted their plans. And in the end, this careful concealment not only prolonged the regime's ability to carry out its crimes, but also left a legacy of denial that would persist long after the guns fell silent. When the war turned eastward and German forces surged into the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, the conflict took on a new and far more brutal dimension. The invasion, known as Operation Barbarossa, was framed not simply as a military campaign, but as a crusader war of annihilation against what the Nazi leadership portrayed as the twin enemies of Bolshevism and the Jewish people. The vast territories of the Soviet Union, with their millions of Jewish residents, were seen as the next great frontier for the regime's racial vision, and the opportunity to push the policy of mass killing into open, relentless execution. This was the moment when the SS, already the backbone of the regime's ideological enforcement, was mobilized on an unprecedented scale. Alongside them came the Einsatzgruppen special task forces whose sole purpose in the newly occupied lands was to hunt down, concentrate, and eliminate entire communities. These were not conventional military units bound by the rules of war. They were mobile killing squads, trained and indoctrinated to see themselves as the sharpest edge of the Reich's racial mission. Their orders were chillingly clear: target political commissars, partisans, and above all, Jews, men, women, and children, and leave no trace of resistance behind. The killing began almost immediately after the Wehrmacht advanced into Soviet territory. In towns and villages across Lithuania, Latvia, Ukraine, and Belarus, Einsatzgruppen units followed close behind the front lines. Sometimes they arrived alongside the army. Other times they entered once the fighting had moved on, the sound of battle replaced by the grim business of rounding up civilians. Local collaborators, motivated by their own prejudices or by the promise of power and favor, often assisted in identifying victims, guarding them, and even carrying out the shootings. This collaboration gave the massacres a terrifying speed and efficiency, allowing them to spread like wildfire across the occupied territories. The methods were as direct as they were devastating. Victims were ordered to gather under the pretense of relocation, registration, or labor assignment. They were marched to secluded spots, forests, ravines, fields where trenches had already been dug. Sometimes these pits were prepared as mass graves before the killing began, a grim testament to the premeditation of the operation. In places like Babi Yar, outside Kyiv, tens of thousands were executed over just a few days, their bodies filling the ravine in layer after layer. The gunfire echoed over the landscape, and then there was silence, broken only by the sound of shovels as the earth was pulled over the dead. This was killing at close range, faced, the kind that left both physical and psychological scars on those who carried it out. Some perpetrators struggled with the task, not out of compassion for the victims, but because of the strain of repeated, intimate violence. The SS leadership recognized this, and began experimenting with methods that would distance the killers from their victims. Such as the use of gas vans, these mobile chambers allowed groups to be murdered without a shot fired. The exhaust from the vehicle piped into the sealed compartment. It was a grim innovation, born out of the desire to make mass murder more efficient and less taxing for the perpetrators, a chilling echo of the techniques tested earlier in the T4 program. The scale of the slaughter in the Soviet territories dwarfed anything that had come before. Entire Jewish communities that had existed for centuries were erased in a matter of weeks. The victims were not just men of fighting age, but women cradling infants, the elderly, and children barely old enough to understand what was happening. The rationale given by the killers was that these people were enemies of the Reich, a threat to the racial and political future they envisioned. In reality, they were simply human beings caught in the path of an ideology that left no room for their existence. For the regime, these actions served multiple purposes. They were a continuation of the policy of keeping the mass killings far from Germany's own soil, ensuring that the worst atrocities took place in territories where the victims were strangers to the German public, and where secrecy could be maintained more easily. They also allowed the SS and other loyal units to deepen their commitment to the cause, binding them through shared participation in acts that could never be undone. This created a grim fraternity of silence, a network of men united by the knowledge of what they had done, and the understanding that they could never turn back. The Einsatzgruppen reports, meticulously compiled and sent back to Berlin, recorded the numbers of those killed as if they were nothing more than production statistics. These documents spoke in cold, clinical terms, but behind each figure was a life cut short, a family destroyed, culture extinguished. The leadership studied these reports carefully, measuring progress, refining tactics, and using the results to plan the next steps in their campaign of destruction. The mass shootings in the East were not an isolated phenomenon, but a bridge between earlier policies of persecution and the industrialized killing that would soon define the Holocaust. They demonstrated the feasibility of annihilating entire populations in a short time. And they hardened the will of those carrying out the orders. By the time the first extermination camps in occupied Poland began full operations, many of the men who had worked in the Soviet territories were transferred there, bringing with them the experience, the methods, and the moral detachment honed in the killing fields of the East. What began with the invasion of the Soviet Union as a campaign of conquest quickly became a campaign of extermination. The Einsatzgruppen and their allies turned vast stretches of countryside into open-air cemeteries, leaving behind not just physical graves but an indelible mark on history. The lessons learned in those months about logistics, secrecy, and the capacity for mass killing would be applied on an even greater scale in the camps that followed. And just as before, the atrocities were kept far from the German heartland. The orders were carefully distanced from Hitler's own name, and the killing machine continued to turn, fueled by the momentum of a vision that sought to erase entire peoples from the map. By the time the mass shootings in the East were in full swing, and the machinery of persecution had already driven millions into ghettos or toward execution sites, the regime sought to tighten its grip even further. It was no longer enough to separate communities physically or to attack them through propaganda alone. The leadership wanted every Jew, whether in occupied territory or within the shrinking sphere of German-controlled Europe, to be marked in a way that left no doubt about their identity. Thus came the order that Jews must wear a visible badge, a yellow Star of David, sewn onto their clothing, placed over the heart, impossible to hide without risk of punishment. This was more than a bureaucratic measure. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare. For years, propaganda had painted the Jewish people as dangerous outsiders, as the supposed source of economic hardship, political unrest, and moral decay. Posters, films, and radio broadcasts repeated these claims until they seeped into the background noise of daily life. But for all its reach, propaganda still required the public to imagine the target. The yellow star removed the need for imagination. Now, anyone in the street could see, at a glance, who had been labeled as the enemy. The order carried immediate and crushing consequences. Jews who had once tried to blend into the broader population found themselves suddenly exposed, stripped of the possibility of anonymity. In cities, they walked past shop windows and offices where they had once been welcome, now met with stares, whispers, or outright hostility. Children in schoolyards pointed and jeered. Former friends crossed the street to avoid being seen speaking to them. The star acted as a constant reminder to its wearer that they were considered less than the people around them, and it reminded everyone else that the regime's narrative was the only one permitted. What made this policy especially insidious was how it intertwined with the message that the victims themselves were to blame for their fate. Propaganda did not just identify Jews as a threat. It insisted that every measure taken against them was a justified response to their alleged behavior. By forcing them to wear the star, the regime could claim it was merely ensuring public safety, as though the people so marked had brought the danger upon themselves. This narrative allowed ordinary citizens to rationalize the discrimination, to see the exclusion from public spaces, the confiscation of property, and even the violence as inevitable consequences rather than deliberate cruelty. In occupied territories, the enforcement of the badge served another purpose. It facilitated the work of the police, and collaborators in rounding up victims for deportation. A marked person could be stopped, questioned, and detained without cause. In some places, Jews were forbidden to ride public transport, to enter certain streets, or to shop outside designated hours. The badge made these restrictions easy to enforce and impossible to escape. Even attempts to remove or hide it were met with harsh punishment, often imprisonment or worse. The policy also deepened the isolation that had been growing since the first waves of restrictive laws and professional bans. Inside the ghettos, the badge was redundant. Everyone already knew who lived there, but outside, it created invisible walls between people. A Jew who ventured out with the star on their chest entered a world that had been trained to see them as untrustworthy, diseased, or dangerous. In this way, the badge was not just a tool of identification, but of dehumanization, turning human beings into symbols of everything the regime told the public to fear. The introduction of the star was timed carefully. By the early 1940s, the Nazi leadership had already tested how far they could push anti-Jewish measures without provoking widespread unrest in Germany. They had learned from the T4 program and from the early deportations that distance, secrecy, and the appearance of legality could keep the population passive. Now, as the final solution accelerated, they saw the star as a means to normalize persecution in plain sight, to make the presence of marked individuals a daily reminder of the supposed need for resolute action. For many Germans and people in occupied lands, the badge worked exactly as intended. It turned neighbors into informants, bystanders into silent enforcers. A person might not actively harm someone wearing the star, but they might look away when that person was beaten in the street, or shrug when their home was emptied. Each time this happened, the line between propaganda and reality blurred further, making it easier for the next step, deportation, to be seen as just another measure in an ongoing process. For the wearers, the badge was a slow form of suffocation. It robbed them of dignity, community, and safety long before it robbed them of life. Some tried to resist by wearing the star with pride, sewing it neatly onto fine clothes, or pairing it with defiant posture. But resistance was dangerous, and in the end, the star often served its intended function: to make the victims visible, vulnerable, and set apart until the moment came to remove them entirely. By the time trains began to carry large numbers of Jews from Western Europe to the killing centers in the East, the star had done its work. It had made those who wore it easier to find, easier to arrest, and easier to portray as outsiders whose disappearance would not disrupt the daily lives of those left behind. It had turned entire populations into unwitting accomplices, conditioning them to see the removal of their neighbors not as an abduction, but as an administrative act. The Yellow Star, like the Einsatzgruppen massacres and the secrecy surrounding the camps, was part of the same relentless logic that drove the final solution, each measure built on the last, reinforcing the idea that the victims were not victims at all but participants in their own undoing. And in that way, the star was not just a symbol of persecution, it was a tool of control, wielded with the same precision and purpose as any weapon on the battlefield. By the winter of 1941-1942, the persecution had advanced far beyond restrictions. Propaganda, badges, and scattered massacres. Across the vast territories under German control, millions of Jewish men, women, and children had already been dispossessed, corralled into ghettos, or executed in rains and forests. Yet, in the minds of the Nazi leadership, these measures were only the prelude to something larger, something that would sweep across the entire continent and leave no remnant of Jewish life behind. The killing was no longer to be piecemeal, subject to the limitations of geography or manpower. It was to be a coordinated, systematic effort, conducted on a scale so vast that it would encompass every corner of occupied Europe and beyond. It was in this atmosphere that senior officials were summoned to a villa on the shores of a frozen lake in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee in January 1942. The setting was elegant, almost serene, its quiet surroundings masking the weight of what was about to be agreed upon. The men who gathered there were not, for the most part, the ones who would wield the weapons or open the gas chambers. They were bureaucrats, ministers, and high-ranking officers, each representing a piece of the Reich's sprawling administration. Their task was not to debate the morality of what was planned. That question had long since been settled in the minds of those present, but to formalize the logistics of mass murder on an industrial scale. Around the polished table, Adolf Eichmann, Reinhard Heydrich, and other key figures laid out the blueprint. Detailed lists had been prepared, showing the Jewish populations in each European country, from the millions in the Soviet Union to the few hundred in distant territories. The total reached approximately 11 million, a number that included people in lands not yet conquered. Revealing the sheer ambition of the plan, the solution would not be limited to Germany or the occupied East. It would extend to France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, the Balkans, even to places as far as North Africa should the opportunity arise. The language used in the meeting was deliberately clinical, couched in euphemisms that made murder sound like administration. Terms like evacuation to the east and special treatment concealed the reality, allowing participants to speak freely without confronting the full horror of their intentions. But beneath the coded phrasing, everyone understood the goal. Deportations would be organized with the efficiency of a postal system, trains running to designated points where killing centers were being built or expanded to handle the influx. The process was to be uniform, systematic, and relentless. This formalization marked a shift from improvised killing to a centralized program. The Einsatzgruppen's shootings in the East had demonstrated that entire communities could be erased quickly. But they were labor-intensive and carried psychological costs for the shooters. Now, the killing would be moved into purpose-built facilities designed to operate like factories of death, with methods that distanced the perpetrators from their victims. Gas chambers would replace firing squads as the primary tool, and crematoria would ensure that evidence was reduced to ash. The meeting also settled questions of jurisdiction. In the past, conflicts between military authorities, civilian administrators, and officials had slowed operations. Wannsee smoothed these frictions, making clear that the SS, under Himmler's authority, would direct the overall effort while other agencies would supply resources, transport, and local enforcement. Each participant left the villa knowing their role, bound together by the shared understanding that they were contributing to a single, unified campaign. Even in the midst of war, the scale of the undertaking was staggering. Trains had to be scheduled without disrupting military supply lines. Camp construction and expansion required materials, labor, and secrecy. Deportations had to be timed to avoid public unrest, though the conditioning of populations through propaganda, badges, and isolation had already made such resistance unlikely. For the leadership, the challenge was not whether the plan could be executed, but how to do it quickly and without drawing unwanted attention from outside observers. The Wannsee Conference was not the moment the idea of genocide was born. That idea had been implicit in Nazi policy from the beginning. Rather, it was the moment the genocide was organized into a project that could be measured, monitored, and completed with the same cold precision used to plan military campaigns. It was where the disparate strands of persecution, the legal exclusions, the propaganda, the ghettoization, the shootings were woven into a single tapestry of annihilation. In the months that followed, the machinery of death accelerated. Camps like Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka were built for one purpose only: to kill as many people as possible in the shortest amount of time. Auschwitz, already functioning as a concentration camp, expanded its facilities to become the largest killing center in the system. Deportations from across occupied Europe fed these sites, each transport part of a schedule drawn up in offices hundreds of miles away, where men in uniform or tailored suits worked over ledgers and maps. The plan encompassed not just the physical destruction of individuals, but the erasure of an entire culture. The communities that had once been vibrant centers of learning, faith, and art would be emptied, their buildings looted or repurposed, their names remembered only in fading records. The perpetrators understood that they were engaged in something unprecedented in scope, and they intended it to be permanent. For the victims, the shift from scattered violence to organized deportations was often invisible until the moment the trains arrived. Many had endured years of oppression and believed that nothing worse could come. But the formalization of the plan at Wannsee meant that there was now a timetable for their destruction, a system in which their fates were calculated, scheduled, and carried out without hesitation. By the time the villa at Wannsee returned to its quiet routines, the machinery had been set in motion. The decisions made there would ripple outward, reaching from the forests of Eastern Europe to the streets of Paris and Amsterdam, from the ghettos of Warsaw to the islands of Greece. It was the point at which the genocide of Europe's Jews became not just an ideology or a series of atrocities, but a fully operational program, executed with the precision of an empire that had turned its bureaucratic talents toward the destruction of millions. And in that moment, the path from persecution to extermination was not just envisioned, it was scheduled, resourced, and set to run until nothing remained. From the moment the plans at Wannsee were finalized, the focus shifted to turning theory into an unbroken chain of action. The leaders had agreed on the numbers, the logistics, and the need for facilities that could handle the vast human tide the deportations would produce. What was needed now were places designed not for detention or forced labor alone, but for killing on a scale that firing squads or improvised measures could never achieve. Out of this cold calculus came a network of sites whose very names would become synonymous with industrialized death. Belzec, Treblinka, Majdanek, and Auschwitz. Belzec was among the first to become operational under this new phase. Constructed in the southeast of occupied Poland, it had no pretense of being anything but a place for elimination. The camp's layout was simple and efficient, a reception area where arrivals were processed under false pretenses, a pathway leading to sealed buildings, and beyond them, mass graves hidden from view. Here, gas chambers were used as the primary method, an approach chosen to speed the process and spare the perpetrators from the directness of shooting. The system was refined quickly, with transports arriving in regular intervals, each emptied with chilling precision. Treblinka, located to the northeast of Warsaw, would take this model and expand it. It was designed to process thousands of people each day, its operations resembling a production line in which every step was calculated to maintain order until the final moment. Victims were told they were going to bathe or be disinfected, their belongings carefully collected and sorted for shipment back to Germany. The gas chambers, disguised as showers, allowed the killing to proceed swiftly, while burial pits were replaced over time with cremation to obliterate physical evidence. Treblinka's methods became a grim benchmark for efficiency. Its operation so effective that within little more than a year it had claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands. Majdanek, near the city of Lublin, served a dual role. Unlike the strictly extermination-focused camps, Majdanek also functioned as a labor camp, supplying forced workers for the war effort. Yet its capacity for killing was immense, and gas chambers were part of its infrastructure from the outset. The presence of both killing facilities and barracks meant that some prisoners lived for weeks or months under the constant shadow of death, a reality that underscored the camp's role as both a tool of exploitation and annihilation. Majdanek's proximity to a major city also meant that its existence could not be completely hidden, a fact that spoke to the regime's growing confidence that public knowledge would not result in significant resistance. And then there was Auschwitz, the largest and most notorious of them all. Originally established as a concentration camp for political prisoners, it evolved into a complex with multiple sections, including Auschwitz, the main camp, Auschwitz-Birkenau, the primary extermination site, and Auschwitz-Monowitz, dedicated to forced labor. Birkenau became the centerpiece of mass killing operations, equipped with gas chambers capable of handling thousands at a time and crematoria that burned day and night. Trains arrived from across Europe, from France, the Netherlands, Greece, Italy, and beyond, each transport following the same grim procedure. Some arrivals were sent immediately to the gas chambers, while others were selected for temporary labor, their ultimate fate merely delayed. The scale of these camps required a level of coordination that had been perfected in the months following 1C. Deportation schedules were meticulously planned so that each facility operated at or near capacity without becoming overwhelmed. The killing process was streamlined. Arrival, deception, separation, execution, and disposal. Even the disposal of bodies was optimized, with the shift from burial to cremation not only serving to erase evidence but also allowing for continuous operation without the constraints of available land. These places were more than just physical locations, they were the embodiment of the regime's transformation of ideology into machinery. Every brick laid, every rail line extended, and every timetable drawn up was part of a system in which human lives were reduced to numbers, and those numbers were reduced to ash. The cold efficiency of the process masked the raw brutality at its core, creating a distance between the decision-makers and the reality of what was being done. In Belzec, Treblinka, and Sobibor, the so-called Operation Reinhard camps, the killing was so rapid that entire communities vanished in weeks. The ghettos emptied into these facilities, their inhabitants swallowed without trace. In Majdanek and Auschwitz, the presence of both labor and extermination allowed the camps to extract every ounce of labor or value from their prisoners before killing them, an approach that fit neatly into the wartime economy. In every case, the camps were designed not just to end lives, but to do so in a way that could be sustained, repeated, and scaled up as needed. By 1943, the system was operating at its peak. The same trains that brought raw materials and troops to the front returned filled with human cargo, each journey ending in the same fate. In offices far from the camps, officials tracked the numbers as if they were managing a supply chain. The victims' identities stripped away and replaced with quotas met or exceeded. The geographical spread of the camps ensured that the killing could continue even if one site was disrupted, making the network resilient and adaptable. The existence of these facilities was the logical endpoint of the progression that had begun years earlier. The rhetoric of exclusion, the laws of segregation, the badges, the ghettos, the massacres in the East, and the formalized decision at 1C. Each stage had been a step toward the creation of places where the act of killing was no longer improvised or occasional but constant and mechanized. For those who passed through their gates, there was almost never a way back. The promise of showers or resettlement was a lie repeated thousands of times. Its purpose not to comfort but to keep order until the machinery of death could do its work. And when it was done, the trains were ready for their next load, the cycle repeating itself with clockwork regularity. Belzec, Treblinka, Majdanek, and Auschwitz were not accidents of war. They were deliberate creations, designed with care and purpose, their efficiency a testament to how far the regime was willing to go to achieve its vision. They stood as the culmination of years of policy, planning, and propaganda, the final, terrible link in a chain forged long before the first gas chamber was built. The vast machinery of destruction that unfolded across Europe did not operate in isolation. It was not the work of a handful of leaders or the soldiers who guarded the camps alone. For the final solution to function on the scale envisioned, it required the participation, whether active or passive, of countless individuals and institutions far beyond the walls of the extermination sites. This was not merely a military operation but a networked enterprise, drawing on the resources, skills, and cooperation of civilian industries. Transportation systems and local administrations each played a role, some driven by ideology, others by profit, and still others by the inertia of obeying orders without questioning their purpose. Among the most vital contributors were the chemical companies whose products became tools of mass killing. Chief among them was the manufacture of Zyklon B, a pesticide repurposed for use in the gas chambers of Auschwitz and other camps. The executives and technicians who oversaw its production and distribution knew precisely where their shipments were headed and for what purpose they were intended. Contracts were signed, invoices processed, and deliveries made, all under the guise of fulfilling legitimate orders for pest control. But the volumes ordered, the destinations, and the secrecy surrounding the transactions left little doubt. These companies were not distant bystanders, they were embedded in the process, providing the means by which the industrialized killing could proceed. No less essential were the men who drove the trains. The railway system was the lifeline of the final solution, moving human cargo from ghettos, transit camps, and occupied cities to the death camps with chilling efficiency. Conductors, engineers, and dispatchers followed timetables that dictated not the movement of goods, but the delivery of thousands of lives to their end. They saw the conditions inside the freight cars, the overcrowding, the lack of water or ventilation, and they knew that the passengers would not be returning. Yet the trains ran on schedule, their routes coordinated with the same precision as military supply lines. Because to halt them would have required more than personal doubt. It would have required outright defiance of the system. Local officials, too, played their part, often making the machinery of genocide run more smoothly than the architects in Berlin could have hoped. In towns and cities across occupied Europe, mayors, police chiefs, and administrative clerks assisted in compiling lists of Jewish residents, organizing roundups, and seizing property. Some did so out of conviction, others to safeguard their own positions or to gain favor with the occupiers. Many participated in the looting that followed, taking homes, businesses, and personal belongings left behind by those who had been deported. Without their cooperation, the process of identifying and gathering victims would have been slower, more chaotic, and far less thorough. In France, the Vichy government's collaboration meant that French police arrested Jews and handed them over to the Germans without the need for German forces to extend themselves. In the Netherlands, civil registries made it possible to locate nearly every Jewish family, resulting in one of the highest deportation rates in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, local auxiliaries often worked side by side with German units, helping to guard ghettos, escort deportees, and maintain order at collection points. Even in places where resistance movements existed, there were others who facilitated the occupiers' goals, whether through active participation or by turning a blind eye. What made this collaboration so effective was its ordinariness. The people involved were not always ideologues or committed party members. Many were simply doing their jobs as they saw them, fitting their tasks into the rhythm of daily life. An accountant processed the invoices for train fuel. A station master ensured that a siding was clear for the next transport. A factory worker loaded canisters onto a truck. None of these tasks, taken alone, bore the weight of the atrocities they enabled. But together they formed the infrastructure that made the killing possible. The profits made from this system were not incidental. Companies that provided chemicals, construction materials for camp expansion, or uniforms for guards benefited financially from their contracts. Railways collected payment per person transported, turning the movement of deportees into a revenue stream. Local administrators and civilians acquired homes, furniture, and valuables at little or no cost. For some, the war and its atrocities were not just a time of hardship but of opportunity. This intertwining of self-interest, obedience, and complicity blurred the lines of responsibility. It allowed individuals to convince themselves that they were not truly part of the killing, that they were only fulfilling their duties or following the law. Yet without these layers of support, the goods produced, the trains run, the lists compiled, the system could not have functioned. The camps, no matter how efficient in design, could not feed themselves with victims without the cooperation of those beyond their fences. As the war progressed and the scale of deportations increased, the reliance on these civilian networks only deepened. The cess could not be everywhere at once, nor did it need to be. The bureaucracy, commerce, and infrastructure of entire nations had been woven into the fabric of the genocide, turning what might have been a series of brutal but localized crimes into a coordinated operation spanning the continent. When the war ended and the extent of the atrocities came to light, some of these participants faced justice, though many did not. In courtrooms, defendants claimed ignorance, insisting they had no real understanding of what their work contributed to. Others argued that refusal would have meant imprisonment or death, a claim that history has shown was not always true. The truth was often more complex, a mix, conformity, greed, and, in some cases, genuine belief in the cause. The involvement of chemical companies, train crews, and local officials stands as a reminder that the final solution was not the work of a few isolated figures, but a vast undertaking sustained by thousands of willing or compliant hands. The gas chambers and crematoria may have been the final stage, but the journey to those places began in offices, factories, and railway yards, where ordinary tasks became threads in a web of destruction. Amid the vast machinery of repression and murder, where cooperation and silence were the norm, there were rare moments when defiance broke through the fear. One of the most remarkable of these came not from soldiers or organized resistance movements, but from a group of ordinary women who refused to be moved by intimidation. Their protest unfolded in the heart of Berlin, within sight of the very government that had perfected the art of silencing dissent, and yet it achieved what few believed possible. It forced the regime to yield, if only briefly. In February 1943, the war had turned against Germany on the Eastern Front, and at home, the pressure to complete the deportations intensified. In Berlin, the Gestapo launched a massive operation to round up the last Jews still living openly in the city. Most had been spared until then because they were in so-called privileged marriages unions with non-Jewish Germans that had provided temporary protection from deportation. But as the Nazi leadership grew desperate, even these exceptions began to vanish. Hundreds of Jewish men married to German women were suddenly seized and taken to a collection center at Rosenstrasse 24, a building in central Berlin used to hold prisoners before transport. When word of the arrests spread, their wives and relatives began to gather outside the building. At first, it was only a few women, standing in the cold, demanding to know where their husbands were and why they had been taken. The women shouted through the barred windows, calling their loved ones names, and the prisoners inside shouted back. The police ordered the crowd to disperse, but they refused. As the hours passed, more women arrived, some bringing children with them, until the crowd swelled to hundreds. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the winter air, refusing to be intimidated by the armed guards watching them. For a week, the protest continued. The women returned every day, braving not only the cold but also the possibility of arrest themselves. At times, the police tried to scatter them, threatening to open fire, but the women held their ground. They called out for their husbands to be freed, chanting and demanding explanations. The standoff became an open act of defiance against the deportation policy, right in the capital of the Third Reich. Passers-by noticed. Whispers spread, and the very public nature of the demonstration made it impossible for the authorities to pretend it was not happening. Inside the regime, there was debate over how to handle this. Shooting unarmed German women in the streets of Berlin would have been a shocking break from the careful policy of avoiding direct harm to Aryan citizens. The leadership feared that such an action could spark wider unrest at a time when morale was already fragile. At the same time, the protest was an embarrassment, undermining the image of total control. In the end, pragmatism won out over brutality, in a decision that shocked even some of the women involved. The prisoners from Rosenstrasse, many of whom were already on deportation lists, were released and allowed to return to their homes. The victory was rare and limited. It did not change the fate of millions, nor did it stop the machinery of genocide. Many of the released men would continue to live under threat, and some were later arrested again. Yet the Rosenstrasse protest demonstrated something powerful. The regime could be pressured, even in its own capital, when the dissent came from those it could not easily demonize or destroy without consequence. It was a reminder that the system relied not only on fear but also on the perception that resistance was futile. When that perception cracked, even briefly, the outcome could change. The women's courage did not come from weapons or political power, but from personal ties and a refusal to abandon those they loved. In that sense, their stand was both deeply personal and profoundly political. They were not trained activists, and most had never openly opposed the government before. Yet in the face of losing their husbands forever, they overcame the fear that had kept so many silent. Their unity, persistence, and visibility forced the regime into a position it usually avoided, making concessions under public pressure. The Rosenstrasse protest also stood in stark contrast to the vast networks of cooperation that had made the final solution possible. While chemical companies fulfilled their contracts, railway crews kept the trains running, and local officials compiled deportation lists, these women chose to stand in the street and demand the return of their loved ones. They did so knowing the power of the state they were defying and without any guarantee of success. In a city where public gatherings were tightly controlled and dissent punished, they transformed a sidewalk into a front line of resistance. In the aftermath, the story spread quietly. The regime did not publicize the release, but the memory lingered among those who had seen it happen. For the women who stood outside Rosenstrasse, it became a testament to the power of persistence and the rare moments when humanity could interrupt the rhythm of destruction. Even within a system that sought to control every aspect of life, there were cracks, and sometimes, if pressed in the right way, those cracks could widen, if only for a moment. The protest has since been remembered not just as an act of love and loyalty, but as proof that collective courage, even among the seemingly powerless, could achieve results that seemed impossible. It did not end the war, nor did it dismantle the apparatus of genocide, but it forced the regime to back down in a specific, visible instance. In doing, it offered a glimpse of what might have been possible if more had dared to stand and refuse. As the war neared its grim conclusion and the scale of the destruction was becoming impossible to hide, Heinrich Himmler sought to frame the narrative in a way that shifted all moral responsibility away from the perpetrators. In his speeches, he presented the genocide not as an atrocity committed by the regime, but as an unfortunate necessity provoked by the supposed behavior of the victims themselves. By claiming that the Jewish people were responsible for their own annihilation, he invited the public to see the final solution as a defensive act rather than an offensive crime. This distortion of reality was not just propaganda aimed at outsiders. It was a tool to ease the conscience of those who had stood by in silence or who had played even small roles in the machinery of destruction. For years, the regime had conditioned its population to see Jewish men, women, and children not as fellow citizens, neighbors, or human beings, but as an abstract threat to be managed. The steady erosion of empathy through laws, propaganda, and public rituals of exclusion made it easier to accept Himmler's claim. People who had turned their eyes away from deportations, who had ignored the absence of their neighbors, could now be told that those absences were inevitable, even deserved, and for many, this provided a final layer of psychological insulation against guilt. This framing also served a political purpose. By portraying the victims as the architects of their own fate, the leadership could cast the German people not as complicit, but as passive witnesses to a tragic but necessary process. It blurred the line between perpetrator, bystander, and victim, creating a narrative in which responsibility was so diluted that it seemed to vanish entirely. The silence of the population was thus rebranded as understanding, their lack of protest as tacit agreement. In this way, complicity was transformed into loyalty. But this silence was never neutral. Each unspoken question, each refusal to look too closely, each acceptance of official explanations added strength to the system. The final solution depended not only on the orders of leaders and the actions of soldiers, but on the cooperation of bureaucrats, the obedience of workers, and the passivity of millions. Himmler's words worked to seal that cooperation in retrospect, ensuring that even as the war ended and the truth emerged, the public could cling to the idea that they had been bystanders to history rather than active participants in it. It is in moments like these that the story of the Holocaust becomes not only a record of what was done, but also a lesson in how it was made possible. Violence on such a scale did not emerge fully formed. It was built in stages, normalized through repetition, and sustained by the absence of resistance. By the time the killing centers operated at full capacity, The groundwork had been laid so thoroughly that many no longer recognized the enormity of what was happening, or chose not. Looking back, the tragedy is compounded by the realization that silence, once established, becomes self-reinforcing. When speaking out feels dangerous, those who remain silent encourage others to do the same. And when enough people are silent, it creates the illusion that no one else sees a problem. Himmler's claim relied on this dynamic, on the idea that if no one protested, it must be because the narrative was true. It was a final manipulation designed to shield the regime from accountability and to protect the fragile self-image of a nation that would soon face the reckoning of defeat. As we close this chapter, it is important to remember that history is not just the story of those who act, but also of those who choose not to. The lesson here is not confined to one time or place. It is a reminder of how easy it is for injustice to grow when people accept the stories they are told without questioning them. The Holocaust was a unique event in its scope and horror, but the mechanisms that enabled it, fear, propaganda, dehumanization, and silence, are not confined to the past. They remain part of the human condition, and it is our responsibility to recognize them when they appear. Thank you for staying with me through this journey into one of the darkest chapters of history. It is not an easy story to tell, nor is it an easy one to hear. But keeping it alive in our memory is one of the most powerful acts we can take against its repetition. If you found this story important, if it moved you or taught you something new, please consider supporting this work by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps ensure that these stories reach more people, sparking awareness and reflection where it is most needed. And now, as we step away from the weight of these events and return to the quiet of our own lives, I hope you carry with you not only the knowledge of what happened, but also the awareness of how easily silence can serve injustice. With that thought, I wish you all a peaceful night. Sleep well, and may tomorrow bring you clarity, compassion, and the courage to speak when it matters most.